We are going to talk about intake. And if your intake lives in six places or 6,000 places and none of them talk to each other, you may think the answer is to hire someone or add a spreadsheet or follow up harder. Actually, the answer is not any of those. It's to look at the architecture of your process and solve that first. So, intake is an architecture problem, not an admin problem. I want to talk about how your families feel when they're going through your intake process. And just to let you guys know, I found my chat so I can see it and I can see my screen. So if you guys have any questions or thoughts to drop in the chat, please do so while we go through this. Um, the speed to services for your families is directly related to how well you architect your intake. So from your first contact all the way through to services started is how many days. And you may know this off the top of your head already, or this may be a number that you just don't know and you didn't even know you should be tracking it. If you know it or you don't, regardless, you are losing revenue, potentially have idle clinicians. The onboarding side of this is a whole nother conversation. And families who may be ready to start services when they first reach out to you, and then not so Johnny on the spot when you get back to them 60 days later. So all of these delays are costs, and they don't show up on your P&L. These are invisible costs to your organization. So it's really important to bring visibility to them and to talk about them. So in the next 60 minutes, probably closer to 45 now, what you'll walk away with are the 5 mistakes. We'll name them, we'll diagnose them, and we'll talk about them typically in the order that practices usually experience them. Your own leaks, you'll see where your process is losing and where your families are experiencing maybe not so great, pro maybe aren't having such a great experience as they're coming into your company. And then also, what does intake look like when you've solved the architecture problem? So if you guys wouldn't mind dropping in the chat, what is the thing you would most want to fix about your intake process right now? Now, this might change after we run through these 5 mistakes, or hopefully I'll shed some light on things for you that maybe you haven't thought about yet. And so these answers may change, but I want to know where your heads are now. What are you thinking now? What are your biggest issues? So streamlining, communication, and scheduling, that's beautiful. And I think you're hitting on one that we're going to talk about, Claudia. Streamlining means probably you need to be out of the process. Your hands need to be out of the process. Decrease time to onboarding and improving customer experience. Absolutely. And customer experience, I think, Kimberly, I love that you said that because I think a lot of times we ignore that one. We don't think about how the process we set up directly impacts the experience the family has, and then every single bump in the road that they hit with your company, and they will, because no one's perfect, they're going to filter all of those through that lens. Keeping everything together, all the documents, absolutely. That can be a nightmare. Tour conversion, yep. So after they come walk through your center, what's the next step? And do you have a process for that? And that would probably be related to one of our mistakes that we talk about, which is the communication piece of things. Okay, so let's dive in. I am going to ask you guys to learn like a clinician and not a student. And so what do I mean? And I'm including myself in this, I think have a really bad habit of collecting information through our senses. And it feels really good when we're getting the information, but that's all it is. It's a collection of information. It gets filed away. Oh, that's a good idea. It might be a quick feel good, you know, here and there for the next 45 minutes, but then nothing is different on Monday. So my challenge to you guys is to learn like the clinician that you are, and as a skill acquisition activity where you say, oh, this makes me realize X as I'm going through this. So think specifically about your organization. What are you learning? What are you going to stop doing? Maybe write it down because that like cements things in. And then what will I test on Monday or change on Monday? So take that action step of what is this going to, how am I going to do things differently? So before we dive in, there are two ways today that you can use this information, and hopefully it's not just information, hopefully it's a skill building exercise. You can take it and do the do-it-yourself path. I'll give you things that you will, aha moments and kind of the beginning runway to get you off and running so that you can actually start building your intake process. And I have some more resources too that I'm happy to, we'll share the video and all of that after the fact. And I have additional resources I can send out to you as well. So you can take all this and you can run with it. If you get to the end of this and you're like, I actually want additional help, I'm going to offer a private working session and we'll look at your specific intake together. So it's up to you, either path. I want you to think back for a minute why you started your practice or why you got into the field. And my guess is that it's probably related to being able to serve more families. You felt like you could do something better than a place where you worked, or you saw an opportunity to give someone a better experience. Maybe it was more on the employment side of things. You wanted a better working environment. But I'm sure that all of you want a practice that runs without you having to be in every single decision. And so that's what we're going to build toward. When I started, I had my hands in everything. So I've built, scaled, and exited 3 ABA companies across 5 states up to 8 figures in revenue. And when I started, I touched everything. I thought, well, I'm the one who's going to do it the best. No one cares as much as I do, so I'm going to do everything. I did have some systems, but really not. I hate to admit this, and this is a recording, so now I feel even worse saying it live, but I will. I didn't believe that panic attacks were a real thing. I thought that it was just people being overly stressed. I didn't really know what to think. I just didn't believe it until I experienced my first one. And the minute you actually think you need to go to the emergency room, you realize they're very, very real. Your body physiologically reacts to stress at certain breaking points in such a strong way. And I realized I just couldn't keep controlling everything. So the shift for me was, all right, I'm going to because I can't be in everything. So somehow I have to determine how to prioritize what I will be in. And so I put a dollar value on my time, and it was high. I mean, it was reasonable, but it was also high, right? I didn't value myself at $35 an hour. I didn't value myself at the value of a BCBA that I would hire. So it needs to be higher than that. What would it cost you to hire a CEO to run your business? That's your dollar value if you're having trouble with where to land for that. And then anything that cost less, I didn't do. So that was the first shift in my thinking. So when we were building our first company in Maryland, we were running about 60 days intake. It was a little over 60. A client would request services. It would take about 60 days to get through all the rigmarole. And we cut that down to less than 30 days from first contact to services started. And we did that not by working harder. We fixed the architecture, the process that family would go through, all the handoffs to other departments, all of that we looked at with a fine-tooth comb. Now, as you're growing your company, you're going to have the same gap. So one thing that I realized, I've consulted with companies, I've had multiple companies in ABA Engine, I've built companies, I've been behind the scenes of dozens and dozens of companies of multiple sizes. And from brand new startups to 5 million plus organizations, beyond 10 million plus, I mean, even larger organizations, I usually say about 2 to 8 million in revenue, you are forced to deal with some of these problems that we're talking about today. Under 2 million, you can, especially if you're a self-starter and you just grind, you can probably get away with not having this architecture in place. But you are forced at around 2 million to deal with it. Something that I realized as I was scaling that this had to be addressed. All right, our 5 mistakes. Let's get into it. So the first one is handling intake yourself to save money. You can never save your way to making money, especially not if you're the one doing all of the things. So the reframe here is what we talked about earlier. Your time is the most expensive resource in the business, and every hour on intake is an hour not spent growing your company, and that cost doesn't show on the P&L. Okay, so what do we do with it? If the cost never shows on the P&L, what is the thing you are not doing? So to bring this down to you right now in your company, what is the thing you are not doing while you are chasing intake? And you guys can drop it in the chat. You can write it on your own notes. It helps to put like pen to paper so you can go back and see this because just again, taking this information in without putting some concrete takeaways down is not going to help you make a plan to make changes. So, for example, are you not doing supervision that's necessary or mentoring or planning strategy? Owner bottlenecked intake moves at the owner's spare time pace. And the problem with this is then that controls speed to services, the timeline of speed to services. So if you're bringing intake in based on when you're available to bring intake in, that's what's going to control your speed to services for families. That's what dictates the timeline. I love this quote by W. Edwards Deming. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. He's the father of modern quality management. If you don't know who he is, his ideas rebuilt Japanese manufacturing. I had to look this up. Of course, I did not know this off the top of my head. So Toyota's system is what descends from his thinking, their process. One thing I love about this is just thinking about it from the perspective of when a system keeps producing a bad result, the instinct is to treat that result as a malfunction. So, like bad luck, bad month, a bad employee. So, Deming's point is that there's no malfunction. The system is doing exactly what it's designed to produce. And this should sound familiar to you because we say this exact same thing in ABA, right? We believe the environment produces the behavior it's designed to produce. So we change the environment, we get a behavior change. We change the system, we get a better outcome. You see the parallel. So if intake takes 60 days and nothing is going wrong, a 60-day intake is the output your current process is built to deliver. So if you don't like the output, then you need to look at the system that's delivering that output and change it, adjust it. So, and this might be something that you want to do on your notes, but you're welcome to drop it in the chat. Name one intake step that you personally handle that doesn't need your clinical or strategic judgment. Now, this might be hard. I might have to bust a couple more of your held beliefs. I had some held beliefs here that would have made it difficult for me to answer this question. But right now, what is one intake step that you personally handle that doesn't actually need your clinical judgment or strategy? And that's how you know where to start. What's that step? Probably is your starting point. Okay, mistake number 2, waiting until it's broken to fix it. So the false belief is I'll build a real system when I actually need one. Right now, what I've got is manageable. This is the worst thing you can do. I have to say, this is one of the hardest lessons I learned as I was scaling. You have to put things in place for your next level of scale. Because if you don't think in advance, when you get to that next level of scale, you're operating with your previous level of scale, systems, people, stuff, and it will become chaotic and stressful. And it creates more headache to try to correct when everything's on fire. A system is always manageable until the week that it isn't, right? Like you're good until you're not. The moment it breaks, whatever that stress fracture is that comes in, maybe 3 referrals in a week, maybe yours is 10 referrals in a week, maybe your admin who knows all the things just walks out one day. Or there's an insurance change. We all have experienced that. Medicaid decides that they're not going to credential your staff, or they're going to pay cuts, or I mean, there's a million things, a million things. Instead of constantly reacting to those breaks in your system, think about how in advance you can design a system that could, an environment that can assume those potential issues. Now, there's some you're not going to see coming, like that's just the nature of the game. But if you can get 80% of them, if you can think about what are things that could break my system, and you could design the system based on what those potential things could be, then you're so far beyond where you are right now. And that's true with anything. For us, when we cut our 30 days off of intake, we did it while things were fine and not in crisis. And the reason why I even knew to start looking at it was because I had already gone through multiple breaks where I didn't have stuff in place. And we were staring down the barrel. That's so funny. It was fun. It sounds like it was negative. It was not. But we were looking at going from 2 centers to 7 centers pretty quickly. And I didn't have the systems in place to be able to execute on that. So I knew prior to that kickoff that I had to get stuff in place. Mistake number 3 is throwing people at a broken process. The false belief usually goes something like, if I just hire another admin, this will stabilize. Now, this is so common, and it's so common that I know that this is not how to fix it, and I still have a habit in ABA Engine, my company that I'm running now, of going to this place because it's easy and it's feels safe. And so I kind of still default to, oh, I just need to hire someone for that. I have got to get that out of my head as the first line of defense, because maybe I do need to hire someone, but if I have a structural problem, a new hire is going to inherit my structural problem, and then I'm still going to have a structural problem. So that's not always the best way to handle things. When we were in Maryland and we had families waiting on our waiting list and a small intake team, and we were looking at scaling. This is across multiple centers, not just one site. If I were to bring in a new hire, but my process didn't work, my architecture wasn't there, then I still have a broken system. I haven't fixed the problem, and now I'm carrying a salary on top of that. So it's not a people issue, it's an architecture issue. And I knew that I needed to look at the full picture. And it's just kind of like start. It doesn't have to be perfect. We started revamping things and we didn't get it right on the first time. We revamped it, we implemented it. We were like, oh, this is still broken. You go back through and you look at it and you look at it again. Now, hopefully I'm going to shortcut some things here because we're talking about the mistakes when you're building this architecture. So mistake 4 and 5 are going to be more like when you're thinking about building the architecture, what things to think about in your head. So hopefully I'll shortcut that learning curve for you a little bit. So mistake 4, and I'll tell you, this was a big one. And this was one that we didn't learn until after the fact. And you probably have already read Treating Communication as an Afterthought and dismissed it because it's very dismissible. Communication seems like, oh, it's just something people do, right? Someone who is good at this job, they'll just communicate. So it should be an afterthought, right? It's something people already know how to do. And nothing could be further from the truth. And so I'm going to tell you why this is so important. Every intake breakdown is a communication breakdown. You build rapport with families on intake calls, and then through your process, if it's not all aligned, you can destroy that rapport that you've built. And so you do have to design communication as part of the process. You can't just assume that it's going to happen correctly throughout the process. So here's a couple things to think about as you're designing that conversation, designing the communication for your intake process. So one thing to think about is this idea of the curse of knowledge. And that is once you know something, it's very difficult to remember or understand how it used to feel before you knew it. And this is incredibly applicable to the intake process. We have been in this world of ABA, autism, working with children, as clinicians. Our admin have been in this world of ABA. All of the buzzwords, all of the things that we say, they're so common, they swirl around us daily. But for a family who just got an autism diagnosis, has no history of autism in their family, I mean, I know that we're trying to bring awareness to this. I know there's a huge push, but guys, we've got to remember we're in the middle of it. So it's like our world. There are families who this is not their world until it is. And then they may have heard autism for the first time. They have no idea what the process is to get through insurance. They have no idea that they don't even know what ABA means. They have no idea that an ABA treatment plan or assessment is not the same as their diagnostic assessment that their psychologist or developmental pediatrician did. They just don't know. And so this is an important point to think about when you're building your process. You could have families who have never had ABA before, just received the autism diagnosis for the first time. You're talking to them from this place of living in this world instead of meeting them where they are, which is probably in a lot of uncertainty, fear, um, kind of a unsureness of what's going to happen next. And there's a lot of power in being able to recognize that and structure communication that meets a family where they are versus assuming that they just know these things that you know. That's a big one. Another one is the availability question. And again, this is one that we learned by accident. It was both frustrating and quite an aha moment. So we had our intake team that was working with families on the call, and they were establishing rapport and blah, blah, blah. And the family would go through the intake process. Then they would get to our clinicians, and we had block scheduling in our clinics. And so they would get to the clinician would do the assessment with them, and there would be a scheduling conversation. Well, the intake team didn't really have a scheduling conversation, but you know what they did do is they asked the family their availability. Because that was one of the things that we had, that was one of the data points that we wanted to collect so that the clinician had an idea of like what the child was doing, what the family's constraints were, yada yada, right? The problem with that simple, seemingly innocuous question is it set up a story in the family's head that they would be able to, and I don't think that they like thought this consciously necessarily, not from a place of negativity or anything, but it set up this idea in the family's head that they would be able to dictate the schedule based on their availability. We asked them their availability. Why else would we ask them their availability if we weren't going to work around it? This was a big aha moment for us because we were losing children at the assessment phase. And we realized, oh, it's because families are asked their availability. They make assumptions about what scheduling is going to look like. So they create this story in their head. They get to our clinician's like, we've got block scheduling, and based on the hours I recommend, this is your schedule. And all the rapport that was built just broke, shattered to pieces because the family's expectations were that we were going to work around their schedule. When I talk about intentionally designing the conversation, this is the perfect example. What are things that you're saying or not saying throughout your process, very specifically at the beginning of your process, that create an incorrect story in the family's head. So put yourself in the family's shoes and think about, how does this land for me? What would I think about? What would I assume? What would I believe based on that? And then you may need to change part of the way you're communicating with families through your process. Another thing we realized very quickly that was, and this is also funny because I mean, we do this in ABA, right? Visual supports. So in ABA Engine, we have a pizza tracker, and it's just a visual support. And there are other ways I'm sure you can do this manually yourself, but giving families a way to understand visually as a whole, like what's the entire process that I'm going to be going through, and where am I right now? It cuts down on calling, so it saves time back and forth. But just from the perspective of the experience the family has, it gives them a better experience because everything, when you understand what's going to happen next, you can reduce anxiety levels and stress levels. And so you're just giving the family the gift of knowing what the process is and what's going to happen next. And it's a simple gift to give. That's another big one that we learned that was very helpful through our process. Okay, mistake number 5, building your intake process in silos. So there are different departments that touch intake. And if each department has its own goals, intake process is not going to run itself. It's going to be a little bit chaotic. When you hand off from one department to the next, there's a process in that handoff. And if that's a weak handoff or if there are breakpoints in there, obviously your process breaks. So if you're looking at this as a whole, you can optimize for the whole of the goal instead of each department optimizing for what their priorities are without seeing the whole system. And I'll tell you a story here. An example of where this breaks is, and this is a real life story that happened to me. When you have different departments that have different competing contingencies and priorities, your overarching business priority can get wrecked. So if you have an intake team whose goal is to get the right kids into the right clinics with the right clinicians as fast as possible, but maybe you have a marketing team who's incentivized by the amount of kids that they have coming through the funnel, you can see where this could break. So I'll tell you my story. Marketing team was incentivized to have the most number of kids on that intake spreadsheet list that the intake team pulled from. The intake team was incentivized with the speed at which they could place the kids correctly. So they would go through the spreadsheet, they would pull the kids that were right fit based on multiple things. You have these parameters for your business, I'm sure. Distance, age fit with clinicians, skill set, all those kinds of things. And there are some kids on that list that we would never have been able to take because of various reasons. So they were not a fit. So the intake team would give the feedback to the marketing team and say, these kids need to come off of the list. They're not a fit, right? Take them off the list. Well, the marketing team is incentivized by the length of their list. So absolute worst thing that could have ever happened. The marketing team did not remove the children. And one of the children that our team asked to be removed from the list this was not in my company. I would like to give that disclaimer. A child who had died. And the marketing team kept this child on the list because it was in their best interest to have another line item on their spreadsheet. The intake team did not manage a separate spreadsheet. They just went off the marketing team spreadsheet. So the intake team called this family back again and said they had a spot ready. You could imagine that was a very difficult conversation when the mother had to tell the intake specialist that her child had died and would not be taking the spot. So that is an extreme example of where these things can break if you don't think about the competing contingencies. But that is a real world example. That intake specialist took the rest of the day off. Just So, I would have also if I was in that position. But not thinking through competing contingencies and how these things can break is very real. That's a sad example and an extreme one, but a true one. What's the number one thing that you all are focused on right now with your intake? I Maybe I changed your mind on some things, maybe you're focused on something else, or maybe you're still focused on the same thing. But what's the number one thing in your intake that you're thinking about right now? Bottleneck from first contact to assessment, documentation and communication. I love that you said that, Raphael, because and Kimberly, documentation is huge. That was one of our biggest issues as well. Sending paperwork out to families and then expecting them to get it back to you. And this is one thing I don't have as my big five mistakes, but I will give you a bonus mistake. When you send out a 55-page packet and you expect the family to sit down and finish that in one setting and then get it back to you, that's a recipe for a disaster. And we're clinicians, and so breaking that into small pieces, like bite-sized chunks that they can do when they have a couple minutes, just as a quick kind of change you can make really easily, has a huge impact on the speed at which you get that back. Okay, so for mistake number 5, it's not a staffing failure. People don't fall through the cracks because someone failed. It's because the system failed them. So you want to map your intake by your family's experience, not by your department. You want to find the handoffs where they specifically are and think through, how does the family experience this handoff? Are there any issues that could create problems later on down the road because of this or during this handoff? So every mistake is the same mistake, either doing it yourself, waiting for the crisis, hiring at the problem, assuming communication, or building in silos. It all comes back to this idea: if you can architect this in a way that removes those issues, you're fixing the system, and then you don't have the individual fires to deal with. Now, if you guys want to jump deeper into this and look at your specific challenges, and we can talk a little bit more about the forms issue, because that really is a universal problem. And for us and for every company that I've worked with, if I were to look at the timeline of the process from first touch all the way through services started, the step in the process that took the longest was getting the forms back from the family for everyone. It's just universal. Aside from that universal issue, if you guys want to look at the architecture together, I would be happy to jump on a call and show you how ABA Engine could help you with this exactly, like based on your process, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what would it look like in ABA Engine and how could we build it for you? And the conversation is free. Like I said, we'll look at your specific challenges with your intake. And there's pretty much similar process that everything goes through. And I already have mapped out a flow chart, and I'll send that as a resource to you guys when I send you the video, just to give you like a structure of things to think through when you're mapping out your process. But when you look at that structure that I send you, think about these 5 mistakes that we just went through, as layered on top of that, so that when you map it out, you're actually solving for those issues. Well, I appreciate you all. And just as a teaser, I am going to there's 2 sides to this, right? We talked about intake, but you all know that in order for your business to run smoothly, intake's got to be coming in smooth, but onboarding does too. Those are your 2 aspects of the funnel. And then when those are chugging along without hiccups, your business is chugging along because they're matching perfectly. Your clients are coming in, your employees are coming in, one isn't waiting for the other. So I'll be doing the onboarding side as well. And that's great. I appreciate you guys. Please email me if you have any questions. And if you want to set up a strategy call with me, I would, like I said, free. I'd love to do it. Email me and let's set that up. So we are done. Thank you for your time today.